Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. Yeah, please do move forward. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about pricing for a job today. There are these different sort of levels of pricing that we're talking about. The job pricing, the project pricing, the organizational pricing are little bit like sort of Russian dolls in a way. So they kind of sit inside each other. But also it's not completely clean. So there are things that are going to be, that I might mention that are also relevant for the other topics. And there are things in the other topics that are going to be relevant for this. The pricing for production webinar that we did last year was particularly focused on makers in the makerspaces, helping them to price a job for production. So it shares a lot of content with this. If you'd like to have a look at that again, the link is on the screen now, and that recording can also be a resource that you could potentially share with people in your makerspace if they're having challenges around how to price jobs. So I won't be going into as much detail today as that was covered last year. So yeah, first of all, we're going to talk about direct costs versus indirect costs. So direct costs are those things that it costs you by accepting a particular order. So the most classic case is materials. Like if nobody gives you an order to make a thing, you don't need to buy the material to make it. Labor is usually classed as a direct cost because you can exactly work out how much labor was spent on something, or maybe not exactly, but pretty much you can work it out. Even though, strictly speaking, if you've got somebody on salary, you're not going to fire them for half a day if you don't have work for them all the time. So it's not quite such a pure example of a direct cost, but it's generally treated as a direct cost. You can attribute it exactly to a particular order or a job. So on to indirect costs. These are the sort of often termed overheads. They're the costs of running your business. So the cost of your rent is not affected by whether you get a particular order to make writing aids, for example. And so that's an indirect cost, but there's still costs that need to be covered somehow. And I think Andrew's going to talk much more about indirect costs in his section, and we're going to focus a bit more on the direct costs in this section right now. I have to keep stopping myself from pressing my down arrows on the keyboard to move the slides because it's not working, but thank you for moving on. Could you just move to this next slide, please, Andrew? I think there should be a graph on the elements of cost. Yeah, so the main direct costs, so remember these are the ones that can be directly attributed to a particular job, will usually be materials, what's known as direct labor, so the labor of the person who is making the thing, and that can also include labor of somebody who needs to quality check it or do post-processing or something like that. But the term direct labor doesn't include the fact that you wouldn't have got this order if you didn't have a person that you're paying to do your social media communications. So they are that would need to be captured separately under the indirect costs. So direct labor, materials, machine costs is often a significant bucket of indirect costs in a manufacturing situation. And there may be some other directly attributable costs. So, for example, delivery, depending on what the terms are in your contract, like if you have to pay to deliver this item to your customer, then you'd need to also include the delivery cost as a direct cost. Now, there are methods that you can use to work out how much you want to add on top to your total direct cost to cover indirect cost and then have profit on top of that. But in terms of job costing, there's also a way you can think about profit and indirect costs as being part of the same pool of money. And there's an accounting term that's sometimes used in management accounting called contribution, which means you figure out what your cost is to produce the item in terms of the direct costs, and then the difference between your total direct cost and what your price that you're going to charge the customer, that's called the contribution. And out of that contribution, you have to make a contribution towards your indirect costs, and anything remaining is going to be for profit. We can move on to the next slide, please. So material cost is pretty basic stuff, but it's your cost per unit times the number of units. And you should think about the number of units that you're going to need to make in total, not the number that the client is going to get. So let's say, for example, that the client is going to need 20 of something, but you're likely to have to make 22 because there's a 10% failure rate. Then the actual number is going to be the actual cost of the materials. It needs to reflect the extra ones you're going to need to make. In terms of the total, sorry, can you go back one, please? In terms of the total quantity needed, for example, screws, you may have lots and lots of screws in one product. So you need to think about how many is in each product and then multiply that by the number of units that you're going to need to make in total. Moving on, please. And sorry, I'm going through these quite fast, but do absolutely feel free, as Andrew said, to jump in with questions at any time. You can raise your hand, you can ask them in the chat. And obviously we'll also make dedicated time for questions later. One point that's really important is to include all the costs of getting that item to where you need it. So if your client is expecting you to deliver it to them in a different city, you need to make sure you have priced that in. And this is something that applies not just for sort of tenders and making things, but it can very much apply in a grant environment as well. I have previously worked on like giving out small grants to organizations who have quoted me a price for getting something like solar panels that they needed as part of the grant, and then later have turned around and said, oh, but it didn't include the shipping, so we actually can't get them for that price. So whether it's for an item to sell or whether it's for your project costing for grants, make sure you really think about every single cost of getting an item to where it needs to be. And that can be shipping costs, it can be import duties, it can be the need for storage somewhere. Any of these costs, it's important that they get covered. Okay, next slide, please. In terms of the labour costs, and remember we're thinking here about direct costs, so for a particular job, do make sure that you think about all of the time and cost associated with doing that particular job. Yes, Martin, please come in.
Thank you. How do you handle unforeseen costs? Let's say you are planning to do a job within 1 or 2 days, and then you have not managed to get the material as quick as possible. So there's a delay of getting the material within this period of time. So everything which was arranged according to time has shifted, and thus has made you to incur extra costs. How do you transfer this cost back to the client, or do you consume that cost?
That's a great question, Martin. So it depends somewhat on the relationship you have with the client, and also on why the costs have changed. So if it's something that, so the best solution to that problem, I would say, is to try and build in a margin of error, both in your time planning and in your costing, so that you have a little bit of cushion to absorb anything that changes. That's not always possible. If there is something that's really outside your control that changes the costing, then and depending on the terms in the contract, you may be able to charge additional fees to the client, but quite often you won't be able to, either practically or legally. So quite often you will need to absorb that kind of additional cost yourself, which is why it really pays to try and build in a margin, and try to prevent that happening in the first place. Felix, did you want to add something there?
Yes, no, I think also I'll mention it a bit later just to join dots again. But for instance, a big part of dealing with any client that buys stuff, services, or goods from you is making sure that you've got a very good understanding of what it is that you're providing. And also we put, for instance, terms and conditions into our offer, our price, with our pricing, that try and protect us from things like currency fluctuations and things, so that we leave a door open to go back to the client and then renegotiate if a supplier suddenly can't supply us with a component or a sub-component or something, and we need to move the dates or the cost changes. But you can protect yourself by just having those things in terms and conditions, and also having a good open channel of communication, apart from just hedging and trying to add fat for something that might go wrong, which might play against you because it will influence your price. So yeah, at all of these things and combinations of them, it might solve that problem.
Yeah, thanks, Felix. And one thing in particular it can be really helpful to do is to make sure you build in margin in terms of time. So often one of the things that can increase costs, I think, as you highlighted in your question, Martin, is if something arrives late, say, and then everything else has to be compressed, and you may start to have to pay premiums on things. So if you can, then if you're able to sort of build in enough a time fat component, then that can be particularly helpful. If there's any more questions on this point, please jump in any point. Otherwise, I'm going to carry on. So on the labour costs, do think about everything that you're doing to do with this particular job. So if it's something that you're actually going to buy a machine for, then the time that you need to go and buy that machine and get it set up is part of the direct costs of that job. There's always setup time or design time or something like that, and that needs to be costed in, as well as the time to make the products and quality check and finish them. Think also about the time to pack and ship them, to deal with admin and associated tax costs and things like that. And in fact, I forgot to highlight this before, but on your materials cost, don't forget about your packaging materials. That's something that often gets left off, but it does add cost as well. Let's move on to the next slide, please.
I'm going to jump in before we do and just say that step one here is really important. In a lot of grants, you need to build in time for procurement. So if you have a grant that for this project, we are procuring developers, we are procuring consultants. I've started the project back in June and July with recruiting staff. I built into the cost of the grant and charged to RISA my time, my pay for me hiring Benita and Rebecca and the rest of the team. So it's the labor costs in grants, or the procurement time, should be included in there. If you need 3 staff in the project, then you need 3 months and 3 months pay for recruitment. And if you need lots of equipment, you need to pay someone's salary to do that procurement according to the grants rules. So if you need 3 quotes for anything more than $5,000, That's somebody's time that you have to build into it. So it applies to grants as well. Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, Andrew. Great. So on to machine costs. They typically include both direct and indirect elements. The indirect elements are going to be covered a bit more later on, but the direct elements will typically include electricity, which could be coming from a generator, which may be more expensive than grid electricity. There are often consumables. You know, does the machine need sort of grease or lubrication, something like that, or, you know, depending on what it is, there can be consumables. So you need to think about both of these. If you're hiring machines, then that's the whole hire cost is a direct cost. And as Andrew was just highlighting, you should also think about your time to find the right machine and engage into the hire contract and get it delivered. Make sure if the machine is yours, make sure you think about all of the different components of cost. So as well as the energy cost, there is a machine depreciation cost. So the machine is not going to last forever. And generally you will, depending on the type of machine and the accounting rules in your country, you will be writing down the cost of the machine over a period of years. And essentially, for most machines, there is after being used for a period of time, they have no value. So therefore, the original purchase cost needs to be shared out over the time that the machine can be used. There can also be maintenance and repair costs, you know, including the cost of downtime when it's needing to be maintained and can't be used for other jobs, and consumables, as we've mentioned. And again, remember to include any wastage. So if you're going to be making more items than the number in the contract, because some of them are likely to be wasted for some reason, or if you need to make samples first or anything like this, make sure the time used on the machines for those extra items is also included in your overall costing. Next slide, please. Yes, we're going to come on to talk about timing. And how long a quote is going to be valid for. So one thing to take into account is inflation. If you're in a high inflation situation, it is really critical that you put a date, an expiry date on your quotes. It's always good practice to do that. You can say something like, this price is valid for 30 days or something is quite typical. Although if you're responding to a tender, you may find in the tender specification, they may say you have to quote a price that's going to be valid for 90 days or however long, or sometimes it's, you know, 3 years or something ridiculous like that. But make sure you look at that information about how long the quote needs to be valid for, and find a way to ensure that you can still meet the quote even if inflation has gone up in the meantime, and also exchange rates, which I think is probably the next slide.
On a 3-year grant, I would tend to increase salaries 10% every year. That's one of the things I would just do is for a multi-year grant, put it up by 10% every year, just to take into account not only people's long service, but also inflation. Recognizing that in some of the countries we work in, inflation is at 80%. You know, and some of them are in 2% inflation. So you have to sort of also think about what currency you're working in, what you're going to be paying people in. So people might be getting automatic pay rises just because you're paying in US dollars and they're receiving money in Turkish lira or something. But yeah, I would tend, over a multi-year project, I would put in 10% increase every year.
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, we've just covered a bit about currency fluctuations, but do remember that even if you're pricing in the same currency that you operate in, you can still be affected by currency fluctuations if your materials are coming from abroad. You know, because the most material prices are sort of set to some extent globally. Imported materials are. Next slide. And commodity price changes. So for example, when the price of steel goes up, that will be felt, you know, right throughout the supply chain, and it will, you know, it'll impact everybody. Next one, please. And yes, think about how long you have to make the items. This is a bit about what we were talking about in response to Martin's question earlier. If you only have a short time to make the items, then there are often extra costs involved. So for example, and this can often be the case in a tender, they might give you a very long time that your quote has to be valid for, and then they come back to you and say, okay, we're going to go ahead, but we want these things really quickly. And, you know, maybe you have to pay overtime, depending on your labour laws and, you know, how things work in your location. You may be paying overtime to get workers to stay longer. You may be, if can we move on, please? There may be expedited shipping costs. Next slide. Availability premiums. So this kind of thing is like if, let's say you normally buy your filament from a supplier in town who has a good price, but you need some really fast and your normal supplier is out of stock. So you're going to have to buy some from somebody else that's 20% more expensive. That is what I'd call an availability premium. So that's a little bit about the costs of the timing costs. So now we're just going to talk about some sort of general good practices for pricing of anything, for job costing and for grants and all of this stuff. So always check your assumptions. That can be anything from, you know, what currency are you supposed to quote in, to things about how long the quote needs to be valid for, things about assuming that exchange rates are going to stay the same rather than change, assuming that you'll be able to get something at the same price that you paid for it a year ago. All of these things are, you know, can be a risk, and depending on how big the order is and how, you know, critical that it is that you get it right, it's really worth putting time in to check your assumptions. And use accurate foreign exchange rates. So, you know, it's very common. We have a sort of rule of thumb in our head, and like whatever your local currency is, maybe you go like, oh, okay, well, it's normally 5 to the dollar. So you just use that calculation. When you get to, you know, bigger contracts and things, it can make a really big difference. So it's definitely worth using accurate foreign exchange rates based on what you can get from your bank, not from, you know, the ideal mid-market rate. Remember that prices change over time, as we've discussed, for inflation and currency fluctuations and all of these things. Think about how quantity affects costs. So if you need to buy materials in larger quantities, can you get a discount? If you're buying them in smaller quantities than you've bought before, you might need to pay more. The quantity also has a very big effect when you think about like a setup time or a design time. So the design cost per unit can be absolutely massive if you design something and make 1 unit of it, whereas if you design something and you make 100 units of it, the design cost gets spread over many different units. Please always use a spreadsheet when you're doing anything with numbers. I know that I get particularly exercised about this point. And in fact, I have just this week been dealing with an issue of a budget document that had to be submitted in a Word format by somebody, and it was added up manually and the numbers don't add up. You should always do all of your calculations in a spreadsheet and only transfer them at the very last moment to a different format if you absolutely have to. A general good practice for using a spreadsheet: one piece of data, like an exchange rate or something, should appear only in one place in the spreadsheet. and you just like refer to it everywhere else that you need it, so that if the exchange rate then changes, you only need to update it in one place, and you don't need to spend half an hour hunting around to find all the different places that you put the same exchange rate. All calculations should be automatic to make sure that there aren't silly errors introduced. You should always use the inbuilt functionality, even if it's for simple numbers. And check all your logic, you know, double check that you've got everything, and also sanity check your results. Don't think just because it comes out of the spreadsheet, it must make sense. You know, just think about it logically, and, you know, use whatever rough guides you've got, and just make sure that the number you're coming out with actually does make sense. Felix was talking earlier about the terms and conditions for quotes. This is a really important point. And one thing is that you need to make absolutely clear what you're including in a quote and what you're not including in a quote. So it could be, yeah, delivery is a classic example. You know, are you including delivery to the customer's premises? You also need to be really clear about whether you're including, for example, if a customer is coming to you is bringing a design to you, think about whether you need to include time to debug their design, or, you know, adapt it for your machinery. Or if you're not, if they've kind of assured you that that won't need to be done, then put in your quote really explicitly that that is not included, so that if it then becomes necessary, you have the opportunity to go back and say, yeah, actually, we do need to include this. And to add to that.
Yeah, just to say, I mean, in a grant, you often have to put a budget and we talked about this in previous sessions, where the budget might be broken down literally by line item. Here's, you know, staff member 1, staff member 2, here's the booking for the training room, here's the participants stipends, or whatever it might be. So you're often, you know, literally having to show what's in the budget. But you could be doing a budget which is basically on category. So this much for prototyping, this much for implementation, this much for evaluation. So you could be doing it by category almost. When you're talking about a quote, however, and I'm generally thinking that this is something in writing, that you wouldn't necessarily show you the workings behind how you reach that number, but what you've got is a total amount and some assumptions in writing about what that total amount includes, rather than the spreadsheet of all of the calculations. Is that right?
Typically, yes. There might be some situations where you're doing sort of open book costing, and you share your materials prices or something like that, but it's not that common. It's much more common that you just work it out yourself and you don't share the spreadsheet. You just give the price. But it's still really important to be clear what's in and not in that, and especially be careful if you're sort of doing it informally, like verbally, or just sending somebody a price over WhatsApp or something like that. You know, think about how you can make it really clear what you've included and what you haven't. And yeah, if you're buying or selling things internationally, make sure you look at the Incoterms, which is it's a sort of table of rights and responsibilities. It indicates who's doing what, and that is used to be really clear about what's being included in a quote, for example. And if you're tendering, it may sometimes specify what Incoterms you need to quote to. And that, I think, is, yeah, everything that I was going to cover on this section. So thank you very much for that.